Queen Elizabeth II was the longest reigning monarch in British history. During her reign, she saw world wars, presidential assassinations, moon landings, disasters, and many other memorable events. The Queen outlived all those dearest to her, watching the world change with their passing. Her reign represented an enormous change for the country. In 70 years, Her Majesty remained the only constant.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. But I shall not have strength to carry out this resolution alone unless you join in it with me, as I now invite you to do. I know that your support will be unfailingly given. God help me to make good my vow, and God bless all of you who are willing to share in it.
Throughout Her Majesty's life, she was surrounded by influential people who left their mark in time, including her infamous younger sister, Princess Margaret. Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, was very different from the Queen, as she was commonly known as a rebellious royal. But despite their natural differences, Princess Margaret always had a close-knit relationship with the Queen throughout her reign. Follow the story of Princess Margaret, the late Queen's sister. Scandal broke in British newspapers. King Edward VIII wanted to marry American divorcee Wallis Simpson, but Parliament could find no way to allow it. At the time, the rules were very clear. The monarch is the head of the Church of England, and it was simply untenable that the king could marry a divorcee. It was against the law. Despite Sir Winston Churchill's intervention and attempts to change the law at that time, it was not acceptable to the British government, and King Edward was forced to abdicate the throne to be with the woman he loved.
When their uncle, David as he was known to the family, otherwise King Edward VIII, abdicated, it was Princess Elizabeth who told Princess Margaret, and she said, "Uncle David's going away and Papa is to be king." And Princess Margaret said to her, "Does that mean you're going to be queen?" And Elizabeth said, "Yes, one day." And nothing more was ever said about it or between them. And Princess Elizabeth, as we know very well, is able to compartmentalize aspects of her life. So she realized, this girl of 10, that one day she would become queen.
It came as a great shock to the royal household. Elizabeth and Margaret's father, King Edward's younger brother, Prince Albert, was to become King George VI.
His was the first voluntary abdication in 1,000 years of British history. An abdication he explained to his far-flung empire in the most dramatic and heart-rending farewell ever broadcast.
But you believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love.
On the 10th of December 1936, Prince Albert watched as his older brother signed the abdication notice. It was not only a day that would change the rest of his life, but he became distinctly aware of what this meant for his family. His two girls would soon feel the enormous pressure of the crown. It was his job to make sure Elizabeth was prepared for the task she would undertake when she eventually succeeded him, and to teach Margaret the importance of her support to Elizabeth.
Things did change for Princess Elizabeth as heiress presumptive, because it was felt that on an educational level that she needed higher education, particularly when you think of the British Constitution and matters like that, that it was now crucial that she should be very well aware of. And so she was given this additional instruction by the then Provost of Eton College, Sir Henry Martin. I talked to Princess Margaret about this on one occasion and said that you didn't get that higher education. And she said, no, it was always a bone of contention. And I said, well, it was really very short-sighted, because when you think that your grandfather, King George V, was the second son and he was called to the throne, your father was the second son and the same thing happened with him. Here you were the second child. There was only a heartbeat between you and your sister, yet you did not get the same further education that Princess Elizabeth got. And she said it was always a bone of contention.
The Yorks became king and queen. Elizabeth, at 10, was now heir presumptive. Reviewing the girl guides at Windsor Castle, the little princesses Elizabeth, 12, and Margaret, 8, assumed new importance.
This would be the start of a significant transitional period in the two sisters' relationship. They had gone from being two equals to the heir presumptive and the spare. It had an enormous impact on the dynamic of their relationship, and this shift in power and status would move in Elizabeth's favour. King George asked Elizabeth to write a review of his coronation, to get her to take in all the thoughts and feelings she had about the event, as she would one day experience it for herself.
Next, His Majesty is to be presented with the Holy Bible. To enable him to receive it, the Lord Great Chamberlain draws off the jeweled glove, after which the Bible can be delivered.
Elizabeth's admiration for her papa was made quite clear as she described him as looking very beautiful in a crimson robe, and also how Westminster Abbey was covered with a sort of haze and wonder as papa was crowned.
From the coronation chair, His Majesty goes to the chair of state for his inthronization. For royal families, as for the rest of us, life has its times of sorrow as well as joy. With this royal family, the British peoples have shared both. To the King, who in his own words now enters upon a new life, and to his charming Queen, Britain and Empire wish many years of happiness. Long may they reign. God save the King.
At the time of their parents' coronation in May of 1937, white lace dresses had been designed for them, special gold coronets had been made for them, and also trains, the purple robes of their rank. And Margaret was a bit bothered by the fact that her train was shorter than her sister's, and she complained about this, and it had to be explained to her that it had nothing to do with rank. She wasn't being demoted in any way. What it meant was that the train was cut in relation to their height. So as Margaret was shorter, she obviously had a shorter train. So there was just that kind of little thing. Why doesn't that also apply to me? As she grew up, of course, she knew perfectly well why there would be those kind of certain differences.
Queen Elizabeth is one of the most well-known women in history. She is the longest reigning British monarch and head of the Commonwealth, encompassing over 50 countries. She has a real and substantial influence on the world, but before the abdication, she thought she would lead a relatively normal life.
Princess Elizabeth had a very, very happy childhood. She was born in 1926 in the centre of London, in Bruton Street, and it was 6 weeks before the general strike, so it was a time of great political turbulence. But there was still great excitement about this new royal baby, and people were really interested in the royal family, although they never thought that she would be, you know, an heir to the throne, because at the time everyone loved the Prince of Wales. Princess Margaret was born in 1930, and Elizabeth looked after her. She was always really kind to her little sister, a beautiful little sister, and they had a very, very close relationship. They looked after each other, but obviously Elizabeth was the oldest, and so she kind of took charge of her little sister. But they were dressed identically, which must have been quite difficult for Elizabeth. That's how royal families dressed in those days.
Her younger sister, Princess Margaret, born in 1930, became her best friend and confidant as a child. They grew up in a relatively stable and mundane family dynamic. Their mother and father were very hands-on parents, and they spent a great deal of time together. They did not attend conventional school. They were educated by private tutors and did not mix with anybody but aristocratic families. It was a seemingly blissful life, with privilege, but very little in the way of pressure. However, their differences were starting to show, even at a young age.
King George VI, he always referred to himself, his wife and two daughters as us four. And they were a royal family within the broader royal family. But because they never anticipated their ranks and their position and their responsibilities changing, they anticipated carrying on as being this very close-knit, very loving us four. You know, so Princess Margaret and her sister did have hugely enjoyable and very loving childhood. When they were children, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, of course, they had, apparently Princess Margaret had a pretty good left hook. So, you know, and Princess Elizabeth would sometimes complain, Margaret always wants what I want. So I think, you know, what you actually see there between the two of them is sibling rivalry, you know, as there would be with other children, other sisters, other brothers. It's, you know, it's something that one always has to remember, is that essentially these, you know, they may have been princesses, they may have been royal, but they were also human. And, you know, and this was the tone of their lives, that they were very, very close. But of course there were kind of moments where they would kick and they would bite and they would fight, you know, or particularly Princess Margaret would.
Even at a young age, however, their differences were starting to show. Sir Winston Churchill described Elizabeth as a character. She has an air of authority and reflectiveness astonishing in an infant. 4-year-old Elizabeth is said to have said, "I've got a baby sister, Margaret Rose, and I'm going to call her Bud." When asked why, she said, "Well, she's not a real rose yet, is she? She's only a bud." Little did she know how apt her comments were, and how her sister would later blossom into a beautiful woman.
Because there was this incredibly strong, loving bond between Princess Margaret and Princess Elizabeth, that there was always that support there throughout their lives. You know, they were as different as chalk and cheese. Princess Elizabeth, very uncomplicated, very straightforward. Princess Margaret, very complex. You know, her sister in later life described her as being an enigma. And really, that about sums her up, because she was a very enigmatic personality. I don't think Princess Margaret consciously lived her life thinking of the differences between her and her sister. It wouldn't have made any sense for her to have done so. But it has been said that she was jealous of her sister. Well, I always counter that by saying, given how close they were always throughout their life, you know, even if it was just to say hello, they talk on the telephone every day. It's very difficult to maintain that close bond as well as being jealous of somebody.
Before long, the two sisters embarked on a grand adventure with their mother and father. They set off on the first royal tour since the outbreak of World War II, and they made their way to South Africa. Here, Elizabeth celebrated her 21st birthday. She demonstrated her sense of duty and service, making a speech that would captivate her audience as she dedicated her life to the Commonwealth.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. But I shall not have strength to carry out this resolution alone unless you join in it with me, as I now invite you to do. I know that your support will be unfailingly given. God help me to make good my vow, and God bless all of you.
Both princesses were very keen equestrians, and during their spare time they visited Bonza Beach in South Africa and went horse riding. They enjoyed a brief moment of fun and freedom as they explored the area and spent some time just being sisters, laughing and joking around together.
It was in Kenya, at the Royal Hunting Lodge, that the news of the king's death reached his daughter. When she returned from a night in the forest, it was to learn that she is now the queen, acceding to her father's throne immediately. There is no break in the continuity of the British monarchy. It was her own decision to return at once to London.
To both the girls, this was a day that would be truly devastating. They lost their father, King George VI, and although he had some health issues, it was somewhat unexpected as he was still relatively young.
The rulers of our land meet to welcome the new queen. There too, the Duke of Gloucester, her uncle, and the Lord Chancellor. The Premier and Mr. Attlee, leader of the opposition, are agreed in this great moment of our history. Her tour of the Commonwealth cancelled. The princess we knew as a girl and watched in the even growth of her stature comes back to meet her ministers as queen over the great lands that for 15 years acknowledged her father as head.
Princess Margaret had been very close to her father. King George VI is known to have said, "Lilibet is my pride, Margaret my joy." He had adored her. As a young child, she was known to be stubborn and demanding, and her father would indulge her every whim, perhaps because he knew he could never give her what he could give Elizabeth, the status and power of being queen. Margaret already felt a degree of separation from Elizabeth, so to lose the adoring love from her father left her somewhat out of sorts. Following his death, her smoking habit became a serious addiction, which was an unusual habit for members of the royal family other than her father, but something she became very well known for. The grief and loss was seriously affecting her, and soon she would seek out some kind of replacement. For Princess Elizabeth, though also in grief, his death came with an even more significant burden. She was described as remarkably stoic upon hearing the news whilst on tour in Africa. She thought she would have more time to prepare for the throne and learn from her father, but it was her duty to step up and follow in his place. It also cut short the one time in her life that she and Philip could be an almost ordinary family. The time they had spent in Malta whilst Philip was a serving naval officer was a tremendous period of normality for the young couple, but their life was going to change forever. For Elizabeth and Margaret, this would be the moment of the most significant shift in their relationship. Elizabeth takes complete control and authority. Margaret must play second fiddle. For someone born to shine in the way Margaret was, it must have felt like a great sacrifice and sadness. Princess Margaret first met Peter Townsend when she was only 14 years old, and he was 16 years her senior. He served as equerry to her father, King George VI. He had the respect of those around him, being a real wartime hero, having shot down 11 German planes. Some 8 years later, after the death of Margaret's beloved father, she and Peter began their romance. Perhaps, when she was with Peter, she somehow felt closer to the father she lost. The equerry had known the king well, something of a comfort in the great loss she felt. The only real problem with Townsend was that he was recently divorced. With the very recent chaos caused by the abdication of King Edward VIII and his marriage to divorcee Wallis Simpson, it was very unlikely that they would be allowed to marry. Queen Elizabeth felt badly for her sister and desperately wanted Margaret to be with a man she loved, but it put her in a very challenging position. Elizabeth was head of the Church of England, which revoked the right of remarrying if the former spouse was living, which was the case for Peter Townsend. The palace courtiers conspired to get him out of the way, and he was sent to work for the air attaché for the British Embassy in Brussels whilst Margaret was away. She came back to find him gone, which left her completely devastated. Though Margaret understood the pressure Elizabeth was under, tension between the sisters was rising. Margaret wanted to have what Elizabeth had, a loving family complete with husband and child.
Excitement bubbles like champagne in London as Group Captain Peter Townsend returns from diplomatic duties in Belgium to call on Princess Margaret. Another, possibly a climactic phase opens in the much-publicized royal romance that's had the Western world agog. The Queen and her family are watched with keenest attention for a hint of what the ultimate decision may be, yes or no, and what will the princess herself decide. All the world loves a lover, and there's nothing like a happy ending to a royal love story for national rapture. Britain watches with breathless anticipation an exciting week that reunites the sweethearts, brings the captain to dinner at the palace, and closets the royal family with the Archbishop of Canterbury, main opponent of the marriage. Captain Townsend seems unruffled by the tension, but the consensus is something definite had better happen soon, or an overwrought nation may just give way.
Princess Margaret had gone to her sister, by now Queen, to say that she and Townsend were in love and wanted to marry. And the Queen's response was to say, in the circumstances, it's not unreasonable for me to ask you to wait for a year. And this is exactly what happened. At the end of the year, Princess Margaret went back to the Queen and she said, okay, we've waited this year. Now, I'm convinced it was on ministerial advice that the Queen said, I have to ask you to wait another year. Now, that additional year meant that Princess Margaret was then approaching her 25th birthday. And at 25, a member of the royal family, in this particular case Princess Margaret, could have petitioned both houses of Parliament, would not have needed the sovereign's consent, which was otherwise crucial. Now, the Queen could not give her consent to Princess Margaret marrying Peter Townsend. Essentially, don't forget, Peter Townsend was a divorcee. Now, the Queen was temporal governor of the Church of England, and a church that did not recognize divorce. So the Queen also had to give consent to the marriages of all members of the royal family, and this she could not do. Now, it is absolutely not true to say, as has been said, that the Queen prevented them from marrying. She didn't at all. The Queen stood back and she said to Princess Margaret, "This is a decision that you are going to have to make." And the Queen did not want to influence and did not influence her sister in any shape or form. Her attitude was, "I can't do anything. You have to decide what you want to do." Now, at that time, of course, there was opposition from the government here, naturally from the church, and from the Commonwealth prime ministers. And at that time, it was thought that she would have to give up her title, give up her civil list income, give up everything to make what would have been a civil marriage with Peter Townsend. A religious marriage would have been out of the question.
I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. But, mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others.
It was in August of 1955 that Princess Margaret wrote to the then Prime Minister Anthony Eden, and it was a very telling letter. She said that nobody but the Queen knew that she was writing. And she said, "As my 25th birthday approaches, there will be renewed speculation about whether I will marry Peter Townsend or not." And she went on to say that he would be returning to England in October and she hoped to see him. And the very telling sentence was that it was only by seeing him that she could decide whether she wanted to marry him or not. Now, that expresses doubt. So whether or not she knew about the government U-turn is immaterial. There was doubt there, and my own sense, and it's borne out, I think, by that particular letter, was that she decided that although there was still a residual affection, they were no longer, and I think it applied to him too, they were no longer sufficiently in love to marry.
As her 25th birthday approached, she announced that she would not marry Townsend. Perhaps her decision to put duty before anything else takes inspiration from her sister. But she was said to be heartbroken at the time. It was a difficult decision, and one which would play on her mind for the rest of her life. In 1958, Margaret met Anthony Armstrong-Jones. But it wasn't love at first sight. It took many months for romance to begin to grow, after Tony was commissioned to take photographs of Margaret. At the time, Princess Margaret was one of the most eligible women around, and she would have many parties to which she would invite Tony too. Still, many other eligible men were also in attendance, so the press did not pick up on their blossoming romance. They kept it all extremely quiet. However, Tony proposed to Margaret in February of 1960, and the public was very excited at the prospect of a royal wedding. As Tony had no prior history of marriage, to the delight of the Queen, she could give her approval for the marriage.
Wedding day rehearsal of Princess Margaret and Anthony Armstrong-Jones with lots of excitement in Britain. Public attention is focused on last-minute preparations for the procession of the wedding couple from Westminster Abbey to Buckingham Palace.
Because nobody knew that she and Tony Armstrong-Jones were seeing one another, when their engagement was announced, it really was a massive surprise. You know, the media was reeling, partly through enthusiasm and excitement. Like, who is this man? He's a photographer. He's one of us. You know, he worked in Fleet Street. He was a fashion designer, a fashion photographer, a society photographer. He was part of the press, you know. And they didn't know they had no idea that he even knew Princess Margaret. So there was this immense surprise. The public were absolutely delighted, of course, because she was, at that time, she was bigger than Diana. You know, she really was the people's princess and some. So that the fact that, you know, to a lot of people, after, in inverted commas, not being allowed to marry Peter Townsend, now she was going to get married. So there was huge interest around the world. It was the first wedding to be televised, and 300 million people tuned in around the world to watch this. She said to me that Prince Philip kept coming into her room and saying, "If you don't hurry up, we're going to be late." As though her being the bride, it mattered whether or not she was going to be late. And she also, part of the fashion correspondence picked up, was that she wore a hairpiece curled as a chignon inside the Baltimore tiara that she was wearing. She said, "We'd rather hoping that was going to stay on." Britain went to town for the wedding, you know. It was the last time, I think, that the streets had been decorated in the way that they had. I mean, the length of the Mall was strung with white silk banners with the initials M and A on Tudor roses. Outside of Clarence's house where she lived, there was an immense arch of roses, real pink and red roses, some real, some artificial, you know, and this was replicated all the way to and from Westminster Abbey. So there was vast interest and excitement. You know, people camped out for days in the streets to watch the event. It also turned out to be the most magnificent May day, very sunny, very warm. And so it was ideal, really. What she liked about it, one aspect that she liked about it too, was that, as she put it to me, that she loved it that her friends could still watch the wedding, because there were obviously, although there were 2,000 guests at Westminster Abbey, not everybody could be accommodated, and there were friends of hers that for one reason or another couldn't attend, but they could still see it on television, and she absolutely loved that. And it was also the first time that, I think they cost about £2,000 at the time, which is enormous money then, zoom lenses were used for the first time, you know. So, and she looked amazing. We talked about the wedding dress, which Norman Hartnell, the doyen of fashion designers, royal fashion designers, and Tony had said to her that it had to be absolutely plain. There mustn't be a bead or a pearl or a sequin, utterly plain, because the dress had to act as a foil to this magnificent tiara that she'd bought just at auction not long before. And so that is why her dress caused a sensation, because she was known for floaty evening gowns, lots of embroidery and so on, but this was utterly simple, and it did create a fashion sensation, yeah.
Margaret and Tony would have 2 children. David was born in November 1961 and Sarah in May 1964. They led a fascinating life, full of glamour and parties and lots of exciting and important people. But it couldn't last forever. as they allegedly indulged in too much alcohol and recreational drugs. It caused a strain on their marriage. It didn't take long before the press speculated that something was wrong. Tony and Margaret would, however, cause a great deal of controversy with the British people during the tour of the US. In 1965, they travelled around America, meeting with politicians, as well as the Hollywood elite. Quite famously, during their visit to the White House, Princess Margaret would dance with President Johnson, which was said to be very well received, but the visit was seen as scandalous by British people, costing over £30,000. She was banned from visiting again for any official trip for many years to come. In 1960, Margaret was gifted some land on a small island in the Caribbean called Mustique. She built a beautiful home there and would regularly visit for some sense of privacy, and whilst her sister was away on tours. The wheels were falling off her marriage, and both she and Tony began to have affairs.
Mustique really represented a haven for her at all times. You know, when the marriage to Tony Snowdon was breaking down, or had broken down, of course it was somewhere that she could go and leave it all behind. So that was, and it was, you know, it's difficult to understate the importance of this place in her life. By 1963, the marriage was in trouble. 1966, you know, Tony, you have to remember, Tony was a serial adulterer. And when 3 weeks into his honeymoon with Princess Margaret in 1960, Camilla Fry, an old friend of his, a couple called Jeremy and Camilla Fry, great friends of Tony's and of Margaret's, Camilla Fry gave birth to Tony's daughter. And this is, you know, he's just married Princess Margaret. They're only 3 weeks into their honeymoon, and this woman gives birth to his daughter. So Tony Snowdon was a serial adulterer. Princess Margaret did not want an open marriage. This was not her idea of marriage. 1966, when he started working for the Sunday Times magazine and was away an awful lot, he'd asked a mutual friend of theirs, Anthony Barton, to come and keep her company. He allegedly found them together when he returned, but anyway, they had, I don't think she ever had affairs. I think she had dalliances, and I say that because they were never very long. So she had this little fling with Anthony Barton. Later on, there was a dalliance with a nightclub pianist called Robin Douglas Hume. When Princess Margaret met Roddy Llewellyn in September of 1973, Tony had already met, because he'd worked with her on a film, Lucy Lindsay Hogg, with whom he was having a proper affair, proper relationship, and who he would marry once he was divorced from Princess Margaret.
It was the affair with the landscape gardener, Roddy Llewellyn, that the press first discovered. 5 months after they had met, Margaret invited him to stay with her in Mustique, and their relationship continued for quite some time. Meanwhile, Tony was having an affair with Lucy Lindsay Hogg, but both maintained to the outside world that they were still in a happy relationship. In 1976, Margaret's affair was made public after the Sunday newspapers obtained photographs of the princess and her lover in Mustique. The Queen was said to be most unimpressed, and they agreed to announce a separation immediately. In 1978, they divorced, and Princess Margaret became the first senior member of the royal family to divorce in 400 years. Most families' paths meet and separate throughout their lives, with circumstances sometimes forcing them apart, yet it is so often tragedy or crisis which brings them together again. Elizabeth was very supportive during the divorce. Margaret's children would often stay at her sister's to make things as easy as possible for Margaret. Margaret and Roddy remained close for some time, but he grew bored and moved his attentions to Tatiana Soskin, and she is said to have been very accepting and gave them her blessing. She was known for putting on a brave face, but it must have been a great shame for the princess to lose that kind of love from her life. They did remain good friends and would often come round to dine with the princess. The Queen and Roddy never really spent any time together, and the affairs created many problems for her. Still, upon Margaret's death, the Queen is said to have admitted to Lady Anne Glenconner, who introduced them, that she was pleased she introduced the two of them, and that Margaret could have that kind of love in her life. Margaret gained back the respect of the public in her charitable work, being patron or president of more than 80 organisations. She focused on activities and well-being of young people and caring for sick people. In the arts, she loved music and ballet and became the first president of the Royal Ballet, with the Queen serving as patron. Princess Margaret had been having some significant health problems, many with similarities to those of her father, King George. She had surgery to remove part of her lung, just like the King. Princess Margaret died on the 9th of February 2002. To the Queen, this was a devastating loss.
I know the whole country will be deeply saddened by Princess Margaret's death. She will be remembered with a lot of affection. Before she was ill, in the last few years, she gave a great deal of service to the country, and our thoughts are obviously with the Queen Mother, and with all the royal family at this difficult time.
A month later, the Queen Mother would die, and Elizabeth gave a personal video message of her appreciation for the public mourning and love for the Queen Mother. It is said that the Queen was relieved not to have had to do the same when her sister had died, as she felt she may lose her composure. Quite unusually, on the day of Margaret's funeral, the Queen would be seen to wipe a tear from her eye. It is not often the Queen loses her composure, and indicates the level of love and affection she felt for her sister.
The Queen was very, very close to her mother and her sister. So for both of them to pass away within 2 months of each other was, a sort of double shock for her. And she was still, full of grief.
Elizabeth and Margaret had a complex relationship, as most sisters do. They would disagree often and have different ideas about what the monarchy needed to look like and how they should behave. But every step of the way, Princess Margaret remained fiercely loyal to the Queen and was immensely proud of what she had achieved. And the Queen wanted nothing more than her sister to have a happy and fulfilling life. Many years ago, their father said with deep affection, "Lilibet is my pride and Margaret is my joy." Had he lived to see their relationship evolve, his feelings would only grow because of the extraordinary women they both became and the remarkable lives they led. And through everything, the closeness they kept as sisters.